How are you guys doing? Well, this is, we're starting a little late. We may run a pinch late, maybe not. This is session number 1204, the debate, Trump's foreign policy. It's 1 p.m. on Monday. I'm Joel Dyer. I'm the editor at Boulder Weekly. I'm a journalist. I'm an author. I never write very much about foreign policy. It should come in really handy. I did break a couple of Trump stories this year, though, on Turkey, but that's a different thing. My main job is to serve as the, keep things moving up here, serve as the timekeeper, and to pay, I'm the top policeman over you guys. So, gonna ask you to really hold your applause, hold your booze, I like that, until the very end, and then you can pummel all of us. And I really would like you to do it. It's hard, I know, and there's gonna be a fair amount of things that you'll probably think are controversial coming out of this debate, I hope, but you really need to just sit back and listen. Another thing, we've had some discussions with ourselves and John and other people. We're gonna give all of the time in this to the debate itself. So there's not gonna be questions. So just listen in. When we've done this in the past, when they brought the debates back 2 years ago, I've been doing them ever since, and we just run out of time really quickly on the debates. And so we're gonna try to give these folks as much time as possible. I am a really poor authoritarian, so I will need you to police each other. I hereby deputize each of you to talk to your neighbor if they're getting rowdy. It just doesn't work. When I try to hey, you're gonna have to leave, everybody laughs at me. So.
Does this look like a well-regulated militia to you?
It could be. We'll find out soon enough. So with that, let me get the introductions going, and thanks for being here. This is fantastic. I'm really excited about it. This is Heather Hurlburt. I'm not going to repeat everything that's in your guidebook out there. She's been doing foreign policy stuff for a really long time. She was in the Clinton administration. Her current area of study is how policy advocacy can adapt and be effective under intense political polarization. I know. That's pretty amazing. Did you think of that before or after the election? That's good. Over here is Robert Kaufman. He is professor of public policy at Pepperdine. He's on loan to CU. He's the visiting conservative scholar in the Center for Western Thought. He's a political scientist specializing in U.S. foreign policy, international relations, and again, prolific writer, magazines, newspapers. And his fifth book is getting ready to come out from the University of Kentucky Press, which is going to be dealing with the subject of Trump's principled realism as a foreign policy and what that means to the world. So with that, I'm really glad that they're here. We flipped a coin. I'm going to give each of them a moment to speak about 3 minutes about their sort of philosophy and view of the importance of foreign policy and how they would maybe describe the current Trump foreign policy. I'll be timekeeper. I'll be strict. 3 minutes. Heather won the coin toss. Go.
Actually, since we're in a football town here, I believe Bob won the coin toss but elected to defer, as they say. So it's a real privilege to be back here. I love coming to Boulder every year, and I'm so happy that CWA is having this particular debate in no small part because I think liberals spend an awful lot of time saying, oh, Donald Trump doesn't have a foreign policy. And not to spoil things in advance, but one thing I think Bob and I agree on is that Donald Trump does have a foreign policy. And if you leave here with no ideas today other than there is a coherent ideology guiding what is going on in this administration, number one. And number two, there is no boundary between foreign and domestic policy, then I feel like I've won regardless of what happens in the conversation. So thank you, CWA, for giving us that opportunity. So what is this thing that is unspooling in front of our eyes, foreign policy in the Trump administration? It proceeds, I would argue, from a pretty coherent set of fundamentals, which you can hear repeated over and over again in speeches by different administration officials, by the president on the campaign trail, in the White House, on Twitter. And fundamental number one is a perception of the US as under threat, but under threat in a particular way, in that traditional white male Christian culture is under threat, and that's our core security issue. You can see this if you want to go look at the speech he gave in Warsaw, really good example of that. So that's quite a different framing from US institutions are under threat, the lives and livelihoods of Americans are under threat. No, this is a particular sense of a cultural threatenedness. Second, the world that this worldview looks out into is fundamentally zero-sum. Either you are doing something tangible for me or you are ripping me off. There is no in between, there's no mutual benefit, there's no larger good of the commons. Point number three, the language of the strong is force and threats. Diplomacy, agreement, assistance, mutuality, that's the language of the weak. That's what you have recourse to if you don't have force and threats. And that you see applied across the political realm, the security realm, the economic realm. Last point, consistency and advanced planning are overrated, if not actually counterproductive to being able to threaten, browbeat, confuse your opponent, and get what you want. And the argument is that this works great in real estate negotiations, and therefore it will work even better in international politics. Now, someday we'll see the president's tax returns, and we'll be able to judge for ourselves how well this works in real estate too. So just to quickly conclude, as I see my 3 minutes winding down over there, that's not the kind of foreign policy doctrine that I was taught in college and grad school, but it is a very consistent worldview that transitions pretty seamlessly from how you treat people at home to how you behave in the world, with consequences that I look forward to getting into.
I'm supposed to tell you you can't do that.
Unlike Heather, I won't compliment the crowd. It still looks to me, in my 11th year coming, as if I'm at a senior citizen Grateful Dead reunion.
I think that's a compliment.
I know, that's an even deeper problem. I wasn't a Trump person during the campaign. I had deep reservations because I'm a Reagan internationalist, and Trump spoke, especially during the primary campaign, as if he was flirting with an isolationism that I thought would have had the same negative results as Obama's devolution of American power, albeit from a different premise. I've been pleasantly surprised, and I've been pleasantly surprised by the trajectory, including some of his personnel changes, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, that have consolidated the positive changes with Jim Mattis and Nikki Haley as the bedrock. I'd state the premises differently, although there's some shared assumptions to it. Donald Trump believes, and I wouldn't say white Christian culture, but unlike President Obama, who focused on unconventional threats, President Trump and his advisors, Jim Mattis just restated it in his January 2018 statement, focuses on great power revisionist geopolitical threats, which is very traditional, as the prime focus of American foreign policy, ranking China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran the four most significant threats in the three most important geopolitical regions. I think they have that right. unlike President Obama, who believed, and many around him believed, that the arrogance of American power was the problem, President Trump and the people around him, including Mattis, Mike Pompeo, and Nikki Haley, believe in maintaining the preponderance of American power, which they believe, and so do I. It's the subject of my most recent published book, was dangerously eroded over the previous 8 years. Thirdly, Donald Trump emphasizes, legitimately as a point, sometimes illegitimately with his use of the language that undermines the point, the importance of national sovereignty as the fundamental building block of international relations rather than international institutions. Although I wish Trump spoke more about ideals, and he is a work in progress, he's almost like spam. You don't know what you're biting into. Even on the issue of ideals, to quote what was said of Wagner by reputedly Mark Twain, it wasn't. Even on ideals, Trump has been better than his rhetoric has sounded. He has given prominence to defending decent democratic allies, and I think for all his warts, we are much better off now than we were a year ago, much to my pleasant surprise, thanks to Donald Trump. And I didn't think I'd be saying that a year ago.
Thanks, Bob. That's fair. Now you've broken the rules once for each of them. You guys are really supposed to not do that. The way that we're going to do this, by the way, is 3 minutes to a question, 3-minute response, and then a 1-minute response to that response. And then we'll flip it and go the other way. So that's what you'll be watching happen up here. There's a saying around Boulder that it doesn't matter what you were working on story-wise. When the smoke's coming over the flat irons, you pretty much got to cover the fire. And this wasn't what I'd planned to start on today, but I think that because of the news, maybe we dive in on Syria first, just because it's a hot spot that's still evolving and we're not sure what's going to happen there. So as most of you know, because this is always the brightest audience in the world, you have to agree with that, Bob. There was what looks like another chemical attack, the 8th since President Trump took office, in a Damascus suburb on Sunday, and we're not sure what the response to that's going to be, but there has been, President Trump has put the blame on not only Assad, but also on Russia and Iran, and is threatened to take some form of action. So I would be curious, and I'll start over here again because of the order that we've been in. What do you see happening in Syria? How did we get there? How do we handle this current crisis that's unfolding? And any other insights that you might have?
Well, my overall opinion on Syria is really ill-suited for a debate format because absolutely nobody has anything to gloat or crow about when it comes to Syria. The carnage there, more than 400,000 people killed, more than 6 million, that's half the population of the country, displaced, is something that is a shared responsibility of Syrians, of Syria's neighbors, of the nations further abroad, and of 2 US administrations. So I'm not really interested in making political points about how we got here, although God knows there's a lot to be made. But I think it's some war. It's a deeper tragedy that I try not to score too many political points off of. So I'm going to restrict my political point scoring, because I know that's what y'all came for. As you noted, or as you alluded to, a year ago this month, President Trump declaring, using rhetoric very much like what you heard in Bob's opening statement, said, oh, we're not going to be like the Obama administration, where when the Syrian government uses chemical weapons, we're going to come in and we're going to show them what's what. Well, since those attacks a year ago, there have been at least 5 uses of chemical weapons that can be traced to the Syrian government. And nothing was said and nothing was done until this most recent one. And obviously, whatever effect the bombing a year ago had, it had no deterrent effect whatsoever, because the regime has continued to use chemical weapons when it feels like it. Now, other developments that have happened over the year plus that we've had this president in office, the US is now in a proxy war with Russia, to the extent where you have actual Russian mercenaries and US forces firing on each other. And you're thinking to yourself, how many US troops do we have in Syria? Well, we don't know, because this administration actually rolled back the transparency of the previous administration, so we don't know how many US troops there are in Syria, but we do know that they are inadvertently getting into firefights with Russian mercenaries, which doesn't really speak well for our relationship with Russia or the clarity of what we're doing in Syria. In addition, our NATO ally Turkey is now fighting with our Kurdish allies on the ground in something that threatens to bloom into a full-blown conflict in another part of Syria, and that's the part that President Trump has just announced that he's going to pull troops out of. So it's really hard to argue that this represents significant progress over a year ago. It's also really hard to argue that it represents any kind of coherent strategy, nor that it represents any kind of restraining of the great power Russia, which, Bob, you referred to as one of the lodestars of this administration. So I kind of see us, as a civilization, we failed in Syria comprehensively, and then on top of that, this administration is kind of 0 for 3.
Syria would have been a tough situation for anybody. Nevertheless, you have to understand how we got here, because to quote Jim Mattis, Trump on this one inherited a strategic mess. And the source of the mess, in terms of our contribution to it, was President Obama's disastrous decision. You could make a case in 2013 that with the country convulsed by the lacerating debate over Iraq, Syria was a bridge too far. You could have made the case that in 2013, when there really were moderates on the ground, that was the time to intervene decisively. What you can't make a case for is what we did. We talked loudly, laid down a red line, and carried a twig. And that, back down in Syria, not only resonated negatively in the Middle East, you could date Putin's campaign to dismember Ukraine from that moment. You can measure China's acceleration of its predatory behavior in the East and South China Sea to that moment. The Trump administration has a problem here it inherited, but it has one thing right. Iran is indeed not a partner, as Obama thought, but is the #1 local threat in the region which Putin has enabled. I don't know what Trump will do, but I do know this. In international relations, it's absolutely vital to say what you mean and mean what you say. And before Trump acts or doesn't act, and this is true for any president, he or she has to understand that what he or she does, particularly in a digital age, will have immediate global ramifications on the calculations of other leaders, particularly the Chinese and the Russians. You all look too placid, so I'm going to goad you on this one. Here's my prediction, and I'm going to write about it in the book I'm doing. Just as I think that Obama's disastrous decision was a negative inflection point in that administration, I predict that Trump's courageous, decisive, bold move of the American embassy to Jerusalem will have the same positive, resonating effect on American credibility, not only in the Middle East, but globally. To use old Soviet terminology, it is no accident. I don't believe that North Korea at least is contemplating, and we don't know how that will go, negotiations that they would never have contemplated previously, because they take Trump seriously, because he seems to mean what he says and says what he means.
I just want to check that we're talking about the same President Trump who said he was for the Iraq War, said he was against the Iraq War, said he was for it again, who I've lost track of how many times he said publicly in the last couple of weeks that he's pulling all of our troops out of Syria, which will make it extraordinarily difficult to take any kind of decisive action in dealing with Syria. The same president who said he would never talk to North Korea, whose administration has incredibly embarrassed itself by saying different things on different days. And I'll also note that actually North Korea has offered the deal that it's put on the table, which is we will denuclearize the peninsula if you, the United States, also take all your troops and go home. That has been on offer to every administration since the 80s. I wish the Trump administration luck in dealing with it.
Well, obviously from those answers, we could jump to China, the fact that there's 65 million people on the move as immigrants, or Iran, or a lot of other places. I think, kind of in celebration of, is today John Bolton's first day on the job, I think, isn't it? All right, then let's go to Iran, because I think that's going to be another interesting hotbed. So 3 minutes to kind of talk about what you think should happen. What do you think Trump will and should do over with the nuclear deal?
I think that the John Bolton coming and becoming National Security Advisor and Mike Pompeo becoming Secretary of State means that a good day is going to happen, even though it's going to seem a bad day to many people. That Iran deal that we signed is fundamentally flawed, and the Trump administration, I believe, is going to rip it up. And let me tell you why, and I'm in print, why it is fundamentally flawed. One, even if they abide by it, it facilitates Iran crossing the nuclear threshold. Two, it's unverifiable. Why is it unverifiable? In their unwisdom, the Obama administration allowed to make inspector access contingent on Iranians permitting access to their concealed sites. That's never going to happen. Three, even in the rare event that you detect a violation, the Obama administration, in its unwisdom, made the snapback of sanctions. We had Iran on the ropes, and we're now subsidizing it. The snapback of sanctions depends on the acquiescence of the Security Council, where 5 members have a veto. That means the Chinese would have to agree, the Russians would have to agree, and our ally that I liken to hemorrhoids would have to agree, painful to the end, the French. That's not going to happen. And finally, the Obama administration, in its unwisdom, did not include ballistic missiles in the category of things we're regulated. Don't take my word for it. Take Tom Friedman's word for it, tepidly defending this deal in the New York Times in 2015. And he said, wow, did the Iranians play a weak hand and take us to the cleaners? Friedman went on, I want Rouhani negotiating when I sell my house as my agent. This is a terrible deal, and getting rid of it will not only satisfy our strategic interests, the Israelis agree with it, the Egyptians agree with it, and the Saudi Arabians agree with it. And I am pleased that John Bolton almost makes it metaphysically certain that this bad deal is going to go. One other thing, Donald Trump is always criticized on the left for flaunting the Constitution. Not so, and in fact, in this case, it's the other way. This deal, if you read the debates on the Constitution, this deal should have been a treaty. Obama didn't do it that way because he knew the Senate wouldn't ratify it. It's a great day when this Iran deal goes down. Welcome, my friend, and I'm a great fan of the great John Bolton.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that you think that the United States should actually abide by international treaties, because the Trump administration's view seems to be that where we don't like what's in treaty content, it should be changed or disregarded. Oh, you only wanted it to be a treaty so the Senate could have voted it down. Okay. So your summary of the Iran deal was really kind of mendacious, because the thing about national sovereignty is we can't reimpose Chinese sanctions. Only the Chinese can do that. We can't reimpose British sanctions. Only the British can do that. That's why the Security Council has to vote to reimpose sanctions that were imposed by other countries, which is what made the Iran sanctions so effective. You misstated several other points about the agreement. I think I'll suggest to the audience that you should go read the text of it. But more to the current moment. So you look at this administration, and even if one agrees with its view of the world that I laid out at the beginning, you are at the beginning of April, and you have set yourself up between now and the beginning of June. You are going to have a summit with North Korea for which you need Chinese partnership to succeed, because you need China to pressure North Korea. You are going to either blow up, fix or nix the Iran deal, for which, guess what? You need the Chinese again. You need the Russians again. You need the Europeans again. It's very inconvenient, but the global economy requires that you have them all lined up together. You also are taking us to the brink of a trade war, with which, guess what? You need to negotiate with the Chinese to get to a solution. If you could do it unilaterally, I'm sure President Trump would have already done it. So quite apart from one's ideological view of the Iran deal, it's just catastrophically poor management and timing to think that you can jam our great power competitors this much at once as you're changing personnel. By the way, you still have to get your Secretary of State and your CIA director nominee who was complicit in torture through the Senate, which it's by no means clear that you will be able to do. Oh, and did I forget to mention that instead of choosing someone to run the National Security Council who's known for being a conciliator, a manager, someone who can actually make decision-making processes run smoothly, which is what the National Security Advisor is supposed to do, you appointed someone who's notorious for throwing office supplies at staff, screaming, and going around other cabinet officials. So there's a basic competence critique to be made of this administration, which is quite apart from ideology. Since I see that I have 15 seconds left, I'll slide on back to the Iran deal, and I'll note that this deal, which Bob described as being so terrible and unaccepted, our allies, the Israelis, were fine with. The Israeli military believes that Iran is living up to the deal. Far from being unobservable, the IAEA has repeatedly certified that, in fact, Iran is living up to the terms of the deal.
One, Netanyahu hates the deal, and he's right. Secondly, for those who want to be enlightened, with a well-written chapter by a very good-looking guy that's been refereed by very elite people on the right and left on the fatal flaws of Obama's foreign policy in the Middle East and the Iran deal. Get your pens. It's on Kindle. Robert G. Kaufman, Dangerous Doctrine, How Obama's Grand Strategy Weakened America. Heather, you're wrong about the role of the National Security Council. It's not a protocol officer. National security officers, directors often are rightly hardline, and John Bolton is very well qualified. Mike Pompeo is going to be confirmed. And as for waging a trade war, Trump again, and I'm a free trader, but Trump again is doing the type of thing that's necessary to have genuine free trade. What Trump is finally doing is calling the bluff of the Chinese, our greatest strategic threat, who have basically robbed us blind. $200 billion a year stolen in intellectual property, currency manipulation. We need someone like Trump. And the fact that Larry Kudlow is his chief economic advisor, Trump's a free trader.
Well, since you didn't want to stop, why don't we just move over to China and let you keep going? You know, China is one of the two countries within, you know, what I've read and what I can see within Trump's stated foreign policy that he views as our greatest competitors and greatest competition that's out there. So why don't you give me like an overview, or give us an overview of how you view China's relationship to the United States and what you think President Trump is doing right or wrong to fulfill his stated foreign policy.
I think, or I hope, there's general agreement that East Asia is the most important region, the Indo-Pacific region, for world politics in the 21st century, for the same reason Europe was between 1500 and 2000. And if a single hostile power were to dominate those resources, it's elementary geopolitics, Nicholas Speakman, Halford Mackinder, that power would possess global preponderance. Hillary Clinton understood that, at least rhetorically, when she laid out her Asia pivot in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy magazine in 2011. East Asia, the Indo-Pacific, is the #1 region, and China is the #1 potential great power threat to dominate that region, and things are becoming more ominous by the day. It's not usual that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal will agree on something, but they did on the same day. Li Peng, the Chinese dictator, the author of document number 9 that defined Western freedom as existentially threatening, now is claiming to be dictator for life. And China aspires to hegemony in the world's most important geopolitical region and sees the United States as its chief obstacle. The military balance has deteriorated significantly in East Asia because of the downsizing that occurred over the previous 8 years, which Donald Trump wisely, at the instigation of Jim Mattis, is determined to reverse, including building a 350-ship Navy, which is absolutely necessary, if not sufficient, to restore the preponderance of power to make America's alliance in East Asia credible. Trump has that right. Trump has also unequivocally backed, despite his dangerous rhetoric during the primary campaign, Japan and South Korea, and reached out to a potential ally that may be the most important ally we have for the 21st century, a decent democratic India under Narendra Modi, who I think and I hope will be the Margaret Thatcher of India. Modi is free market, very wary of an authoritarian expansionist China, and also very wary and vigilant in dealing with radical Islam, which is a problem that he has, and he's the best guarantor of keeping an unstable Pakistan in the box. So on the fundamentals of military buildup to restore a margin of preponderance, the importance of allies, recognizing China as a threat, recognizing that Japan, China, and India constitute the linchpin of an alliance, I give Trump an A+.
So just first to correct the record, there was not a net decline in military spending over the Obama years. You can look that one up too. The question of how we're doing with China, where Bob and I do share the perspective that China is our major geopolitical competitor and rival, so it seems like an absolutely fair way to start judging the Trump administration 15 months in. Trade deficit is up. China's expansion in the South China Sea, threatening its neighbors, continuing, accelerating over the last 15 months, not pulling back in any way. Indeed, as Bob mentioned, China's leader seems to be expanding and expanding, and not to see the U.S. as a real counter. Militarily, last year was a disastrous year for the U.S. Navy. It had a really embarrassing run of accidents and leadership problems, which again seems to have further emboldened China on top of the rhetoric it hears. Regional trade agreements to bolster our Asian allies. This administration came into office saying, we're going to get rid of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and in its place, we're going to negotiate bilateral trade deals with all of our Asian allies. How many of those do we have? We sort of have one maybe with South Korea, where we forced the South Koreans to renegotiate the agreement, but then Trump threatened it again, so back to that consistency problem I mentioned earlier. So here we are, 15 months in, we have a deteriorating economic situation, a deteriorating security situation, plus the situation on the North Korean peninsula. So it seems very difficult to argue. If you argue that this administration is focused on great power politics, your logical #1 focus would be China. It seems very hard to argue that that's been a success. You now have a trade, an effort to address what, again, actually, Bob and I agree, in a way that frankly would have put us at odds with the establishments in both political parties 2 years ago, by saying we do have a trade problem with China, and we have a trade problem with China that was allowed to go to fester by politicians from both sides for way too long. Now, the problem, as I mentioned earlier, if you believe that national sovereignty is the proper foundation block of everything, and that the proper way to deal with China is bilaterally, then you might get an approach sort of like we have, although you still, frankly, wouldn't be negotiating your tariffs on TV, and you might not be appointing CNN, or you might not be appointing television money reporters to do your economic policy for you. But if you look at the world the way it actually is, which is how I define realism, you look at the world and you say, actually, the US can't take on China alone. What we need is to be working out a cooperative arrangement to pressure China with our allies, with our partners, which the administration just got around to mentioning yesterday that maybe it needed to work with partners. And I'll sneak in one little anecdote, which is that recently there was a meeting of the Group of 20. Both industrial and newly industrializing nations, and it had been hoped that this could be a forum to work together to pressure China. The entire meeting was taken up with other countries berating the US, and there was no time left to talk about China.
And by the way, either of you can ask the other one for an extra 30 seconds if you so choose, and it should be up to the other one to decide if that's okay.
Fact, Obama had us heading to a Navy of 230 surface ships. Fact, that was the smallest Navy since the United States had in 1916. Fact, Obama lowered the percentage of GDP on defense spending to 3.2%. It would have headed to 2.8% had Hillary Clinton won. Fact, the American Navy is delirious that the Trump administration is committed to a 350-ship Navy, and with Jim Mattis's defense budget that Trump has signed on to, that will increase defense spending substantially. And finally, on North Korea, Trump has received an unlikely endorsement, none other than Bill Clinton's former Secretary of Defense, William Perry himself, who said at the Hoover Institute, no administration has done as much concretely as positive with North Korea over the past 25 years than the Trump administration. I agree with him.
So speaking of North Korea, I guess it seems like it was just a few months ago that was the issue that was keeping everybody up at night, because we weren't sure if there was going to be some kind of a nuclear war, potential for a nuclear war. We turned to China in an attempt to get them to help us, and now we seem to be, I'm not sure, we're certainly talking trade war and various other things. How is the Trump administration's, this is to you first, how is the Trump administration's foreign policy with North Korea and the nuclear situation being impacted by what's happening with China right now? And what can we do? What do we do with an already nuclear North Korea? How do you disarm that?
So China is the guarantor of North Korea's continued existence. And China's view is that it does not want a unified Korean peninsula under control of the South being a hostile power pushing right up to its border. So China will go very far ultimately to safeguard the continued existence of the North Korean regime. Doesn't mean China likes the North Korean regime. The Chinese public is very angry at how it perceives itself to be propping up North Korea. But the Chinese they're stuck. So that being the case, the US can get certain help from China, but there's only ever going to be so much. The Chinese are never going to go to the North Koreans and say, you have to give up your nuclear weapons and make yourselves the patsy of the South, because that's not what the North wants. So Beijing is also calculating how much can it get from Trump, and frankly is bewildered by why would you conduct a trade war in such a clumsy way? Why would you come to Beijing last year without a single concrete ask? Why would you make all the bother of traveling there and not ask the Chinese anything that they would have to give you in order not to be embarrassed, but rather just let yourself be fobbed off with a tour of the private part of the Great Hall and extra red carpets and porcelain, and come away empty-handed as Trump did. So looking ahead on North Korea, you also saw, after the North Koreans pulled a nice little theater trick by proposing a summit and getting Trump to accept it, without, by the way, checking with his Secretary of State first, the Chinese then said, okay, now you need to come to Beijing and talk to us. And the leader of North Korea made his first trip out of the country since becoming leader to go check in with Beijing, basically. So we're kidding ourselves if we think we can get anywhere without China. And I certainly, not because I think there's danger of an intentional war, but because I think there's danger of miscalculation, stupid rhetoric on both sides, frankly, continuing escalation of exercises, and one day somebody shoots something down and somebody else lets off a tweet in response, and there you are. So I would very much like to see the summit succeed and put us on a path toward lessening tensions. I'm not such a wild optimist that I think we're going to get to denuclearization, but you're kidding yourself if you think you can get there without China deciding it's in China's interest to do it. And since, unlike our government, and it pains me greatly to say this, but the Chinese are planning far ahead. They're not switching national security advisors twice in a year. And so we are starting this negotiation, which I'm happy is happening at a terrible disadvantage.
China is not going to facilitate any reasonable agreement with North Korea that we can support because of China's asking price. China is North Korea's enabler, and China's overall goal, and they are our most important, most dangerous threat, is to weaken American power in the Pacific that they see as the prime obstacle of this regime's goal to establish hegemony. So after initially flirting with the idea of cooperating with the Chinese on this, the Trump administration has wisely shifted, in my view, in a situation where the alternatives go from bad to worse to relying on robust deterrence, where we give primary emphasis on unequivocally backing Japan and South Korea, deploying missile defense on the South Korean peninsula, bolstering the American military presence in Asia, badly eroded over the previous 8 years. An example of that, Chuck Hagel, Obama's Secretary of Defense, the Dove supporter, conceded in February of 2014 that the waters of the Western Pacific, for the first time since 1945, are no longer uncontested because of our build down and China's 20-year double-digit spending to develop an anti-access capability to deprive the United States the capacity credibly to protect space, air, land, and sea power across the Pacific on which robust deterrence of Chinese ambitions depends. For 8 years, our Asian allies, and some that aren't allies, including Vietnam, have clamored for us to do more, and we are finally doing that. The best of a bad situation right now is what I think the Trump administration is doing, relying on robust deterrence, which, for all of the problems of the North Korean regime, unlike the Middle East, where you have more reckless calculators, deterrence has actually worked against this regime for close to 65 years. But I also agree with the Trump administration that there's a certain point beyond which, and I think Jim Mattis is there, the United States will have to choose denying North Korea the threat in American cities with intercontinental ballistic missiles if we arrive at that perilous point. And I think Trump has played a bad hand as well as possible under the circumstances. Nor do I think North Korea would have come to the table, even as a technique, had it been Hillary Clinton.
So I'm delighted to hear you say that you favor relying on robust deterrence, and I'd like to sort of give you my phone and have you call the White House, because
Then I take it back.
The outgoing national security, it's great to have that kind of power. The outgoing National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, has said repeatedly that he doesn't believe North Korea is deterrable, which is not only at odds with Bob, but with the, as you mentioned, the consensus of 20 plus years of American national security thinking, plus everywhere else we've used deterrence successfully in the world to date. So you have McMaster, who's been saying for a year that he doesn't believe in deterrence. No one quite understands why he doesn't believe in deterrence, by the way. Maybe we'll find out when someone writes a book. And then you have Bolton, who has said repeatedly that he hopes we move through the summit process as quickly as possible so that we can move on to staging a preventive war, which, of course, is, number one, illegal, and number two, opposed by our South Korean allies, who are, of course, the ones who would bear the brunt.
Instead of moving on from the potential for a nuclear war, maybe just a little more, what deterrence can work? I mean, we're talking about, you guys are talking about this foreign policy as if you know it's good or it's bad or what, but what can be accomplished from it? If you cannot get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, then what is the solution to that?
Well, the goal, and John Bolton is right, and the means is what we're debating, the goal in North Korea ultimately has to be regime change. Now, how you achieve that is another question, but as long as the North Koreans run one of the most brutal dictatorships in the past 100 years, and there's been a lot of competition, and as long as they have a nuclear capability, which is their only asset to survival, you're going to have a very dangerous situation. And I like Heather, I don't think it's inconsistent to say that you rely on robust deterrence if possible, but the only chance you have of not having to have military force used is to have people who are actually willing to use it. It's the paradox that credibility depends on having a John Bolton or a Mike Pompeo, who's also believes, as I do, that it's ultimately unacceptable for the North Koreans to develop an intercontinental ballistic missile capability that is reliably able to target major American cities. One of the problems on the Korean Peninsula is that, again, it's an array of terrible choices, and all the wargaming on Korea, there's good news and there's bad news. If there's a war, we win. But the bad news is, even if it's a conventional war, Seoul, the South Korean capital, 30 miles from the 38th parallel, 75% of the GDP is generated there, is destroyed by North Korean conventional artillery alone. So this is a terrible set of choices. But allowing North Korea to face us down is also a terrible and probably an even worse choice. And right now, I think the Trump administration is hoping that robust deterrence works, but preparing, and I think being willing to deliver if it doesn't. And I actually think under the circumstances, that's the most prudent approach in a very bad situation.
Yeah, so the North Korean regime is repugnant. I agree with you completely on that. But of course, the more that you say the goal is regime change, the more impossible it becomes to reach any outcome, any stable outcome short of regime change. So actually your way of getting to the goal, number one, of not annihilating Seoul, of not annihilating any American cities, of not annihilating any Japanese cities, which has to be an even more primary goal than regime change. To get there, regime change can't be your goal. So point one. Point two, this is a very hard and politically unpalatable thing to say, and it's a delightful thing not to be in office, running for office, et cetera, but we are not going to be able to get the North Koreans to denuclearize. People had quietly, on a bipartisan basis, concluded this before you saw the breakout run that you saw in 2017, and even less so now, because, as Bob said, this regime perceives its weapons as the key to survival. So what can you possibly do in this situation? You know, nobody thinks there are any good choices here. Nobody thinks there's a brilliant policy that someone has overlooked. You can have a scenario where the best scenario you can get is where the North Koreans don't get any further toward producing a bomb that can reliably fit on a missile, and a missile that can reliably deliver the weapon to the continental U.S., to us here in Denver or anywhere further east. Now, guess what that looks like? Looks like another deal we've been talking about here a little earlier, where you can't put the nuclear genie all the way back in the bottle. So what you can do, you can have inspections, you can have removal of material, you can have safeguards, you can have surveillance. It's a crummy outcome because you're never sure. And we also say right off the top, because again, this is what realism is. Realism is looking at the world as it is. The North Koreans will cheat. The North Koreans have cheated on every deal they've ever signed. We say that at the beginning. But there have been periods where North Korea was not marching forward on its bomb, and there have been periods when it was. And the periods where it was not marching forward are the ones where it was in negotiations, where there were agreements, where IAEA inspectors were coming in. So the best that you're going to do is going to be highly imperfect, is going to be highly politically contentious for all the reasons we've already discussed with Iran, but it's a hell of a lot better than talking about preventive war and, oh, we win, but Seoul gets trashed.
Arms control is Prozac with rogue regimes. How many times are we going to do this? We got into this predicament in the first place because we signed a nuclear deal with North Korea. Bill Perry admits it. It was a terrible deal, terrible idea. Shouldn't have done it in the first place. And the bad omen was Clinton said Carter. And Carter stood on the tarmac with Kim Il-sung, one of the worst dictators of the 20th century, and said, Kim Il-sung has a good heart. Carter wasn't even right physiologically. He died 3 days later of a massive coronary. And what the North Koreans did, what the Iranians will do, is use these negotiations, which is why Trump has to be very careful and why he has to put the art of the deal somewhere where he doesn't see it, because North Korea has a history, as rogue regimes do, of using negotiations as a way to wage war by other means. The last thing we should do is repeat the mistake that got us into this predicament in the first place, inoculating us to the danger while North Korea and now Iran is moving into a much more dangerous posture. Arms control in this situation is the worst of a series of bad options.
It's depressing, isn't it? Not a lot of good answers with any of that. All right, let's change subjects. They're all depressing now. We talked earlier a little bit about moving, declaring Jerusalem to be the capital in Israel. I'm guessing we may have different opinions about the wisdom in that. It's your turn. Why don't you try to help us understand why this was a good or bad idea and what the consequences may be?
This is another one where we have to start with incompetence before we even get to ideology, because you have to remind yourself that the great brains behind the Trump administration's approach to the Middle East is Jared Kushner. And Jared Kushner held a bunch of meetings before he took up this new post. And he said at a certain point, yeah, we've heard enough about the history of the region. I don't really need to know the history. I'm here to make deals and get stuff done. People in the past, they think too much about history. So here we are. Now, the bad news is this is also, you're going to be disappointed, and this is a depressing topic, because there isn't a deal to be had between Israelis and Palestinians at the moment, and that is not Donald Trump's fault. There, I said something nice. So you're in a phase where the best of all possible worlds is to figure out how do you manage the two societies, how do you minimize loss of life, and how do you help the two societies move toward a place where at some point in the future they could make a deal with each other and get to a more permanent arrangement that was less warping, less violent, and less diminishing of opportunity for everybody involved in the region. Now, you wouldn't do that by making sudden moves that no Palestinians and the majority of Israelis don't support. You wouldn't do that by making moves that make it harder for you to work together with your regional and European partners to bring about peace, which is these two things are what the moving of the embassy is. You wouldn't do things that even the majority of the American Jewish community doesn't support, so you're purely doing it to pander to an element of your base in the US and to help Benjamin Netanyahu hang on to power a little longer in Israel. So it's a purely cynical move. And, you know, politicians do that, and that's how you maintain coalitions, and so I don't begrudge them, but this one is going to cost lives, and I do begrudge that, and because it's not going to lead anywhere productive. You also add to that a broader Middle East policy, which says we want to exacerbate the conflict between Sunni and Shia going on across the Middle East. We want to pick a side, because even though the president said on the campaign trail that we were too involved in the Middle East, he still says that from time to time, said it last week about Syria. Nonetheless, we should dive in and pick a side and put the power and might of the US behind accelerating that conflict, behind encouraging the government of Saudi Arabia, the government of Egypt, to think they can do more to oppress their adversaries at home, to foment conflict in the region. And that, of course, will then encourage the Iranians to do even more in return. They're deeply problematic also. Bob and I agree on their being problematic. We disagree on what the smart thing to do about it is. But so you have an administration that, while eschewing many senior personnel with actual knowledge of the Middle East, are happily going around lighting these little fires, and the Jerusalem embassy is just utterly superfluous. It serves no substantive purpose, but it will get people killed and make all the other things we have to do in the region harder.
Disagree entirely. First of all, Heather, it's absolutely wrong that this is Jared Kushner's inspiration. For 30 years, Republicans and Republican presidential candidates have called for moving the embassy to Jerusalem. Donald Trump actually delivered on a promise that was long overdue based on equity and strategic interests, and I think it's going to resonate positively on our credibility, not only on the Middle East, but elsewhere. And as for the so-called effect on the moderate opinion of the region, there isn't a moderate opinion in the region. One of the most disgraceful things of Barack Obama's presidency was the preference that he gave to engaging virulently anti-American, anti-Semitic, dangerous mullahs in Tehran while undermining a decent democratic Israel that is a reliable ally. What Donald Trump has done by this bold move is restore strategic and moral clarity. And contrary to Heather's dire predictions, the initial response has been that countries have actually not responded negatively the way it predicted. Think of the recent remarks of the Saudi prince which would have been inconceivable without Donald Trump finally taken off the table, that Israel will not be confined to an area without defensible borders. So I think that this is not only long overdue, deeply resonant in the Republican Party, but I think Heather's wrong empirically. If you look at the polls in the Jerusalem Post and Al Haaretz, this is a very popular move. Michael Oren, the award-winning historian, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, and classmate of mine at Columbia when he was Michael Bornstein, has written in 2015 and has switched to Likud and become a Trump admirer precisely because he believes that the Trump administration has strategic and moral clarity not only on Israel but the broader issues of the Middle East. And in choosing to support Saudi Arabia and Egypt, Trump is not choosing to support Islamic radicalism in any form, something Obama never mentioned, calling ISIS the JV team to the Lakers. What Trump is doing is trying to forge, and he's made some progress doing it, a coalition of countries in the region, including Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Egypt, that have a clear picture that Iran is the prime danger in the region. Trump's defense statement says that. They're absolutely right, and recognizing the embassy, moving it to Jerusalem, facilitates our interests, our ideals, and our strategic calculations.
I don't really understand how strategic and moral clarity allows you to choose the Saudis who are still funding around the world mosques that are turning out al-Qaeda recruits. I don't really understand how moral clarity allows you to be silent while the Israeli government criminalizes speech, while this Israeli government, this political party, criticizes NGOs by saying they want to turn they want to turn Israel into a democracy. That's our ally. That grieves me terribly to say that. But whatever it is that we're doing, it's sure as hell not moral clarity.
Yeah, it is moral clarity. Israel is the freest, fairest country in the Middle East. Look at Freedom House, bipartisan, venerable. Israel's the only country that's a free society in the region. And as for moral clarity, let me paraphrase Winston Churchill, the ethic of the lesser evil. When somebody asked him, Winston, you hated the Soviet Union, how do you defend this? And he said, sir, on this day, if Hitler had invaded hell, I would have had a sympathetic word to say for the devil in the House of Commons. The Saudis are the lesser evil in a region teeming with tyranny. So that's how I will say that Trump recognizing Iran as the greater danger and backing rather than stabbing Israel in the back, that's moral and strategic clarity on steroids.
I'm going to request 30 seconds back.
Oh, sure, why not?
Just two things. One is, again, you wouldn't necessarily know it from the political rhetoric, but in fact, the largest ever increase in defense cooperation between the US and Israel happened under Barack Obama.
So, I mean, we don't have time. We need to talk about NATO. We need to talk about, the EU. We need to talk about a lot of things. But instead, Bob's going to explain Russia. Because I figure that they want to know something about it.
Easy. Russia is the number 2 threat. And the good news is that Russia is not the type of threat China is, that because for all of Russia's belligerence, Russia is a weak, declining country that is playing a weak hand strongly. And that's what Putin is trying to do. But we should understand what Putin's trying to do. When Putin said to his legislature in public the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the demise of the Soviet Union. You don't have to be Clausewitz to figure out that this is not a partner for peace. And here Trump has some culpability, but he's building on the Obama administration's even greater culpability. Obama gave us the reset. Obama dismantled the commitment to deploy missile defense. Obama grovelingly whispered into the microphone in 2012 to Medvedev, Putin's lackey, when I don't have to deal with Mitt Romney, tell Vladimir I can deliver on missile defense. Obama and his Sancho Panza, John Kerry, they fought arming Ukraine. And Donald Trump initially started off very badly on Russia, and this is his weakest area, to be honest. Mike Flynn and Trump had the same illusions that I think the Obama people had, that somehow Putin could be a partner not only in Europe but the Middle East. The trajectory with Trump on this, with fits and starts, I admit, has been going in a positive direction. And I do know, because I do know them personally, the national security team that Trump now has in place, Pompeo, the great Nikki Haley, who I hope is president someday, Jim Mattis, they all identify Russia as a revisionist power requiring robust deterrence. And again, starting from a weak position, I concede Trump has moved positively, reaffirming Article 5 of NATO, committing us to defending NATO against Russian aggression, something Jim Mattis's defense statement unequivocally reiterates, published in January. So I am overall optimistic about the trajectory, with the proviso, and this is Trump's weakness, one of them, he has many. He's not a conviction politician like Ronald Reagan. He's a transactional politician, and he is vulnerable, susceptible to the idea of his ability, many American presidents have had it, to make a deal. It is my wish and my standard of measure that we continue to judge Trump on this issue by the current, more positive trajectory that has largely, but not unconditionally, reversed his initial naivete that in some ways echoed Obama's.
So should we judge Trump by the comment he made last week that we don't know yet whether Russia is going to be a friendly country or not? It's okay, it's a rhetorical question.
I thought...
You did not
No.
While I'm getting off my one-liners, you can also explain sometime why Reagan didn't move the embassy to Jerusalem. But we have a real problem with Russia. And here it is, that I actually don't disagree with the core of your comments about Putin's revanchism. I think we see that somewhat similarly. The problem, however, that we have is that in addition to being a dissatisfied second-tier a dissatisfied second-tier power with a first-tier nuclear arsenal and a really crappy economic infrastructure and declining oil prices, Russia's also our only pure nuclear power, and has now, thanks to choices made by two administrations, has now ensconced itself in places in the Middle East where we're not going to, we can't reimpose really tight sanctions on Iran without Russia, for example. We actually can't, Russia can make our life very difficult and dangerous in Afghanistan if it chooses, and over the last year it has been aggressively choosing to re-engage in Afghanistan in problematic ways, putting lives of our men and women in uniform at risk. Our friends, the Europeans, have a huge problem with how deeply integrated into their economies Russia is, energy, finance, other sectors. So as satisfying as it is, and my undergraduate degree is in Russian studies, and so I can get down on how nasty Putin is and how frustrating it is to see what's become of that great and beautiful society all day, but we don't have the luxury of saying, okay, we are now moving to a new Cold War and we are never going to deal with you, and awesome, yeah, why don't we egg you into building a new generation of nuclear weapons, which we will then have to expensively counter. So the trouble we have is that you are actually going to have a sophisticated policy that does some containing and some cooperating with Russia. Instead of which we have a policy which is managing neither to contain effectively nor to cooperate effectively. And an administration that at best, I mean, I've never heard anyone describe Michael Flynn as naive before, so I'll take that under advisement. And I'm kind of imagining that meeting that was held between Eric Prince from the Trump transition team and the Putin confidant in the Seychelles Islands. I'm imagining that they kind of sat up at the bar, said, and yeah, you know, that thing Obama was doing, how can we keep that going? You can laugh, he won't get mad at you. Thanks. So it's just nonsensical to say that we're here because Trump was naive. Actually, Trump was a fan of Russia since the 80s. In the 80s, he was advocating doing nuclear deals with Russia to punish the French. And of course, then we can speculate about what else there is that might cause Trump to be particularly favorable toward Putin.
Fact, the Trump administration is arming Ukraine, without which Russia is going to be a local threat rather than a great power threat. As Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski both point out, without Ukraine, Russia does not have a plausible bid to restore an empire in Central Europe. With it, the outcome of the Cold War is on the table, and the Trump administration understands that. Trump administration has bolstered deterrence in Eastern Europe. And we do have the option, especially with Russia. Our GDP exceeds Russia by 7 to 1. The EU's exceeds Russia by 7 to 1. And that disparity is growing. It is easy to contain Russia if we have the moral clarity and political will to do it. China's the real challenge, but the only thing we need with Russia is to understand what Putin is rather than to mistake him as a partner for peace. It seems that Trump has learned the error of his ways and Obama's.
Closing statement, 2 minutes. Tell us what you think about the Trump foreign policy.
Well, I want actually to use my last 2 minutes to draw a connection to a set of issues that we've talked about a little bit less here, which is how the president and people around him talk about and refer to the people and nations of the world. And it's very fashionable, even in liberal circles, to say, oh, that's just rhetoric, it's just tweets, it doesn't matter, look at the actions, look at the advisors, look at Mattis, you know, oh, he can't be racist, there's Nikki Haley. But this is a huge problem, and it's a huge problem for 3 reasons. Reason number 1 is that it just makes us less effective. Years ago, General Petraeus referred to Guantanamo Bay and the allegations of torture that came up under the George W. Bush administration as a ticking time bomb that made it harder for him to do his job and made it harder for him to keep American soldiers safe while they were doing their job. So the kind of just egregious, nasty rhetoric, appointing people to senior positions like Mike Pompeo, who are enthusiastic consumers of sort of paranoid Islamophobia propaganda, makes it harder for our soldiers and our diplomats to do their job every day. Second, what was the great capital that the United States drew from over the last 50 years? It wasn't that our society was perfect. It wasn't that our institutions were unprecedentedly better than anyone else's ever. It was that we were always trying to make them better. And that even when we were racist, we were sexist, we were homophobic, we were imperfect, we at the same time, you could see the struggle of how things were getting better and how people did succeed and how people did come here from everywhere and better their lives in a way that was really meaningful to people in other places. And this endless stream of potty-mouthed, bigoted, sexist, disgusting rhetoric is, oh, I'm never out of adjectives. Last point, it's tearing apart our domestic fabric. And in fact, you remember in my initial comment, I said this administration thinks we're under threat. We actually are under threat, but we're what's shaking ourselves apart. And if we shake ourselves apart at home, we sure as hell can't have a successful foreign policy.
One, if you raise the issue of the danger of Islamic radicalism, that doesn't make you a racist. That makes you sensible. And Mike Pompeo, #1 at West Point in his class, Harvard Law Review, and he actually wrote his way on rather than mysteriously found himself the editor of Harvard Law Review. Mike Pompeo is a decent, very well-versed public servant, and we're lucky to have him as Secretary of State. Let me conclude with an observation of somebody I'm bringing in through the center of Western civilization. My revenge on this town, the great Victor Davis Hanson, who says of Trump, Trump has warts. He's an out-of-borough New York guy, sort of a amalgam, as I put it, of Andrew Dice Clay and Ralph Cramden. But he's like chemotherapy. It may be painful. It may be ugly. You don't want it. There are unpleasant byproducts. But given where we were, given what the alternatives were, and given how far Trump has come in a positive direction, I am greatly encouraged by the trajectory of Trump's foreign policy. And let me add one final area I didn't mention. By unleashing America's grass reservoir of energy that eventually will make us #1 as an energy exporter again, we're not only creating jobs, we're not only stimulating the economy, we are, with regard to Western Europe in particular, making Western Europe less susceptible to Putin's blackmail, and we are on a path of being less dependent on unsavory dictators of all varieties in the Middle East. So, as my heroes from Hawthorne would say, Trump has made it much better than it was a year ago, so that the bad guys know us and they leave us alone. We get around.
I'm pretty sure Bob threw oil and gas in just to get me.
It's a bonus, but there was a reason to put it in anyway.
I'm supposed to tell you guys to be sure and stop by the lobby out here at Macky and see the wonderful piece of commissioned artwork by artist Sam Austin. It's a special commemorative 70th CWA piece and is on sale via auction. And now would be a great time to give Heather Hurlburt and Robert Kaufman a big round of applause. And you guys were great. You actually behaved.